Okay, so this is 1936. By the middle of the year, the Popular Front supported government and the parliament were showing that they were unable to do much of anything to heal the economic difficulties of the country. And strikes involving millions of workers were breaking out throughout the country, with over 120 local general strikes in the first 6 months of the Popular Front. In some areas, workers had begun to occupy factories and sit-down strikes. In Madrid, the streetcar operators seized the transport company. Remember, I told you that was owned by the church, and they ran it by themselves. Landless peasants many of them had believed that the slogans of the Popular Front for land reform were sincere, so they began taking over the big estates and dividing the land on their own. The Zanya government sent police to break up the occupations and arrest the strikers, but the mobilizations went on and got stronger and stronger. On May Day, Largo Caballero led the socialist youth, whom he had not yet lost to the Communist Party, at the head of a huge parade of workers in Madrid. The youth reportedly raised their fists and chanted slogans for a workers' government and the formation of a Red Army. And Caballero came out for overthrowing the capitalist class and instituting a dictatorship of the proletariat. But exactly how that was to be achieved was, I would say, idealistic rather than concrete. At the very least, he should have demanded a break with the pro-capitalist Popular Front government. However, Caballero maintained that the Popular Front government had, quote, not yet exhausted its possibilities. Evidently, after the liberals who were currently running the government were seen to have failed, then the socialists would get their chance to take over the government. But of course, even in that eventuality, the Socialist Party was hardly a revolutionary combat party with a program that could lead the working class to take power. It was a mainly parliamentary formation with a largely reformist program and constantly yielding ground to the liberal capitalists. And moreover, Caballero said nothing about the formation of Soviets or workers' councils, by which means the working class could coordinate its struggles and in time create bodies that could supplant the capitalist state. Simultaneous to the upsurge of workers' actions in 1936, the actions of the fascists had multiplied, with numerous bombings and assassinations. Hundreds were killed in street brawls in Madrid. Carloads of fascists would prowl the streets of the working class districts with machine guns, shooting at people as they passed. And in the countryside, death squads slaughtered people in their homes. So in the meantime, it had become clear to the leaders of the army that the country had entered a revolutionary crisis, and that the moderate Republican politicians in the government were powerless to end it, as they had promised they would. The major question that the military brass had to confront was the timing of the rebellion, because they had to be certain that the army ranks had not grown sympathetic to the actions of the workers and that they show themselves to be reliable in a coup. Now, the Popular Front government knew more or less what was going on, but it publicly tried to downplay any rumors of a coup, censoring the left newspapers that tried to give a warning and denouncing any articles that managed to appear as working to undermine the army. Strike leaders were jailed, union headquarters were raided. They tried every means of repression they could think of to appease the generals, not really realizing that it was already too late for that. It was the same mistake that Allende was to make in the 1970s in Chile. The military rebellion began on July 17, 1936, in Morocco. Moroccan trade unionists declared a general strike, and workers and loyal troops tried to resist the insurgents there, but they were defeated within a couple of days. The Spanish colonial army in Morocco was based mainly on the Foreign Legion, which was recruited largely from desperados and mercenaries, and on native Moroccan troops, mainly Berber tribesmen from the Rif mountainous area in the north. Now, the reason why troops from an oppressed people would join with fascists in a coup might take some explaining. The fact is that these soldiers formed a kind of privileged group in Moroccan society. They were co-opted into the colonial army to police and repress their own people. They'd come out of poverty, and now they could earn a steady wage as colonial soldiers and even earn more from pillaging. So all they had to do was fight, and they were very skilled, very professional at doing that. And if there were any among them who might have given some thought as to the politics of their invasion of the Spanish mainland, they were told that they'd be going there to combat a horde of atheistic communists. And the Republican government, as pointed out, not only coddled the communists, but they served as their colonial oppressors. So now they could get their revenge. And meanwhile, the Republican government, this is after the coup, after the invasion of Spanish mainland, they continued to assure the public that everything was well in hand, sounding something like Trump with regard to the coronavirus. At the same time, Assange asked his cabinet to resign and replaced them with a group of even more reactionary politicians, hoping that maybe that would satisfy the military. But that backfired because the army garrisons that had been wavering were able to perceive that the government was weak, and they too joined the rebellion along with most of the state police units. And the leaderships of the socialist and the communist parties were themselves paralyzed, merely assuring the Popular Front government that they would act once it gave the signal. But the workers in the streets did not wait. They fought back with whatever arms they could acquire, sometimes seizing state arsenals by force. And although the rebels, that is the Francoists, obtained easy victories in the more conservative sections of the country, mainly up in the northwest, they were unable to capture about half of the country's territory, including most of the big cities. In Barcelona and almost every other place where the rebellion had been defeated, authority now passed to the people in the streets. Orwell describes the picture in his homage to Catalonia. He described how armed men and women in blue coveralls roamed the avenues with guns. There was no police force. There was only these volunteer worker police. And the major buildings and hotels have been taken over to become communal kitchens and childcare centers and headquarters for the workers' organizations. In the towns and villages where workers' militias had defeated the reactionary forces, this was mainly in Catalonia, but also, for example, in Aragon, where, in Maro's words, militias from Catalonia marched in like an army of social liberation. Workers' action committees were set up, which constituted the real working governments and supplanted the police forces in maintaining order. They made basic decisions on questions such as the expropriation of local industries and landed estates, building peasant committees to organize farm production and marketing, control of prices, getting food provisions to the militias and into the cities, and much more. All property titles and mortgages and debt IOUs were just tossed into the bonfire. And in essence, they functioned in embryo, much like the local Soviets in the Russian Revolution, except for the fact that there was little attention given towards expanding these committees onto the regional and then the national level, which would be necessary for them to really evolve into the prototype of a Soviet-type workers' government. In many cases, the committees were self-appointed. In Lerida, however, where the PUM had a significant presence, the Revolutionary Committee was ratified by a local constituent committee made up of representatives of the unions and the working class parties. So this situation in the sections of Spain that had resisted the army takeover was one of what we call dual power. The Republican government, this Popular Front government in Madrid, still existed, but its power had been reduced to a shell. It no longer had much of an army or police apparatus to enforce its edicts. All had been swallowed up by the bodies of armed workers. And the only reason it didn't fall was that the reformist organizations, the socialist and communist parties and the UGT, were still invested in it. And there was no revolutionary body to take its place. But although the central government was weak, just its continued existence acted as a constant brake on the development of a real revolutionary workers' government. And soon, the Communist Party in particular would employ the Popular Front government as a lever to permanently set back the workers' revolution. Catalonia had its own regional and relatively powerless Popular Front government called the Generalitat. It was dominated by the bourgeoisie, but all of the workers' groups, including the PUM and the anarchists, also supported or participated in it, instead of simply dispersing it as they should have done. But at the same time, a parallel Catalonia anti-fascist militias committee was also set up. And the body represented itself as a subcommittee of the government, but it really superseded the Catalan government in power. The committee and its sister economic committee came up with a program that called for workers' control, collectivization of big industry, public utilities, transport, collectivization of the big landed estates, workers' control of the banks until they could be nationalized, absorption of the unemployed into collectivized agriculture and industry, and a monopoly of foreign trade. So you can see that with this emphasis on it wasn't a bad program as far as it went, but with the emphasis on building workers' collectives, it reflected the lexicon of the CNT and the anarchists. Little was said, for example, about replacing the capitalist state with a Soviet model or instituting state planning. A lot of the program was, however, carried out with factory committees set up in industrial shops and so on. But with the case, with the banks, for example, it never really got beyond the stage of workers' control. Whereas a real revolutionary workers' state would have moved to nationalize the banks and the other financial institutions as one of its, maybe its first step, and seize their assets. Here, the bank funds and profits in Catalonia remained in the hands of the capitalist class. Now, organizationally, the Anti-Fascist Militias Committee included all the major workers' parties and the unions, and its base was in the local committees of the armed militias throughout the region. But it was a top-down committee, not really an assembly or regional Soviet with delegates elected from the local committees. The PUM put forward a motion to make the committee more representative, but that was never carried out. So here we're on the last section, and we've gone for an hour, but we're almost done. And this, unfortunately, deals with the counter-revolution. Because unfortunately, the summer of 1936 was the high point of the revolution. The entry of the socialist leaders into the Popular Front government in Madrid in September 1936, with Caballero becoming the new premier, was hailed by most of the left, including the PUM, as a great victory. But it was the opposite, since it helped to revive and legitimize the rule of the capitalist government, which had, until then, had been pretty much of a corpse, waiting just to be knocked over. So now, step by step, with the help of the Stalinists, the bourgeois Republicans acted to oppress the revolutionary workers and reestablish the bourgeois state. Once more, the city and state police were utilized to keep order. The periodicals of the PUM and the anarchists were censored or not delivered at all by the post office. Finally, the militias were ordered to disband and reconstitute themselves as units of a national army. And the Stalinists, of course, led the way in dissolving the militias in order to supposedly set the example. Now, the need to build a centralized and professional army wasn't disputed by the PUM or the anarchists, the CNT, because they had some understanding that the war couldn't be fought. But they, in addition to this, they had some understanding that the war could not be fought by military means alone. There was also a political struggle, which reflected the struggle amongst the social classes. But unfortunately, this new Republican army was ordered to be non-political. There was to be no more organized political discussions. Also, the democratic operation of the militias, with their tradition of electing officers, was to be supplanted by the reimposition of an officer's caste. The ranks of the army would be selected by means of a compulsory draft amongst the working people. But the candidates for the officer school were to be selected with preference for the Stalinists and the bourgeoisie, who were considered to be more reliable. And then by the end of 1936, orders went out to begin disarming the militias at the front. This is when they were actually fighting the fascists. That culminated in April 1937, at which time the police even began to collect arms from workers in the streets in Barcelona. The CNT, which had maintained armed defense guards for many years, was ordered to surrender its guns, which led to skirmishes between the CNT units and the government assault guards, the government police, who tried to disarm them. And then, of course, at the same time, the Stalinist GPU went into action with its assassination squads and a network of secret prisons and torture chambers in order to beat down the revolutionary workers, whom they generally accused of being Trotskyist collaborators with the fascists. This was the period of the Moscow trials in the Soviet Union, which were now transposed to Spain as well. Now, Felix Mauro, in his Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Spain, points out that the PUM had a great opportunity in Catalonia to place itself at the head of the masses in a fight against the counter-revolution. But instead of trying to build organs of struggle amongst the workers in the factory committees and so on, the PUM rather naively proposed to the Popular Front government, that is to the very bourgeois Republicans and the Stalinists who were persecuting them, that they collaborate with the PUM to convene a Congress of workers' organizations around the revolutionary program. Mauro exclaims that the PUM had learned nothing from its past experience. So, on May 3rd, 1937, a few trucks of government assault guards arrived at the telephone exchange in Barcelona. The exchange had been managed by a CNT committee since the previous July, when it had been seized from the fascists who had occupied it. So now the government police had come to take over the exchange. However, they were met and warned off by a CNT militant with a machine gun. And immediately the word spread and workers began building barricades around the city. The small Trotskyist organization put out a leaflet calling for arming the working class. Many of them were armed, but already. An immediate general strike and a united front of the POUM, the CNT, and the FAI to fight until the Popular Front government would be forced to resign and its police disarmed. Essentially, the proposal was to organize the conditions for an insurrection in order to enable the working class to take full political power in Catalonia. And then militants in the left wing of the POUM and the anarchist Friends of Durruti and other groups endorsed the proposal too. And as it was, as I said, the armed workers were already masters of the city, and a struggle for ultimate power around a clear program of revolutionary demands and objectives had every chance of succeeding. And Moro says it would have ignited the working class and the poor peasants in other areas of Spain as well. But the central leaderships of the POUM and the CNT said that now was not the time to make a socialist revolution. It was necessary to wait until after the war against the fascists was completed. So these leaderships met together, and it was not to organize the struggle, but to see how to negotiate with the government the conditions of ceasefire. And in response, the government put forth a demand that the armed workers leave the streets, and then the CNT complied, ordering the union ranks to take down the barricades and go home. And the POUM, somewhat reluctantly, soon followed suit, while proclaiming that the workers had won a, quote, partial victory against the counter-revolution. But the POUM's boasting was false. The police rapidly went into action, went around the city to occupy the CNT-controlled installations and arrest the workers' leaders. Within days, a large detachment of government troops entered the city from Valencia to fully maintain order. The Stalinist GPU went into action to destroy the POUM, and soon the Republican Army, dominated by the Stalinists by that time, even went village to village in Catalonia and Aragon to disperse the village committees and give the land back to the oligarchs, with the pretense of building a united front of all the classes against fascism. The revolution had been broken, and with it, the broader struggle for the rights of the workers and the poor peasants was lost. The resulting blow to morale meant that the war against Franco's forces was greatly weakened, although the military struggle went on for another year and a half. So that ends part 2.